I'm going to turn it over to our host, who can turn on his video and microphone. And I'm going to introduce our security services manager, JR Hernandez.
Hey, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. My name is JR Hernandez. I am the security services manager here at Evolve Security. I'm very happy to be here with you today. We're going to have a lot of fun. This is a very interesting topic for me. Yeah, it's going to be fun. I think this is one of the vulnerabilities that people are going to be talking about for a while. So yeah, so it's going to be awesome. Colleen, do you want me to just start sharing?
Yep, go for it.
Okay, awesome. Give me a second. I'll set this up. All right. Can everybody see the first page of the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, well then let's get started. Awesome. So let's talk about log4shell. Okay, cool. There we go. So what is log4shell? So before we go there, we have to talk about log4j, or in this case, log4j2, which is a very popular open source Java logging library, right? So what does that mean? So every Java application, it is best practices to start logging error messages or any sort of logging that you might want to help you troubleshoot in the future, application issues, or just traffic that comes into your Java application. So logging is a very important part of many Java applications. So the log4j logging library is a very popular application that's open sourced library. It is in a lot of Java environments, right? And if you run Java applications, more than likely you're running log4j. That's how common this library is. So that is the reason that everybody's freaked out at the moment for this vulnerability, because the issue comes from running log4j, and it's a very common library that's open source, but it's common to everybody. It's the reason that it's so popular is because it has a lot of functionality that makes it very useful. It's very easy to use. It's very effective. It's very good at what it does, except that it's too good because right now everybody uses it, and one of the functionalities that was added to the log4j library is what's causing the issue here. So with that said, let's move on. Okay, so what does log4shell actually mean? So log4shell is actually comprised of not just one vulnerability. It's made up of a couple of issues. And this is what made it interesting for me, right? So log4j, like I said, is a logging library that is in a lot of Java applications, right? But that's not a vulnerability in of itself. I mean, actually, we want people to start logging, and we want people to log issues. The problem is that there's an extra functionality that got added to the Java library, and it's a Java functionality. That's called JNDI. So that stands for Java Naming and Directory Interface, right? So what this does, and I'll go deeper into it, but this extra functionality that got added to do lookups with log4j is the whole thing that's causing this log4shell issue. So that's still kind of big. That's still kind of, that's still, what does it really mean? Well, it just means that the functionality of logging plus the functionality of lookups in those logs is what's causing this big headache for everybody. And I'll go into like more details in the future slides, but just know that the issue is not unique, but it's also something that is it's new, right? And I think it's gonna cause a lot of waves in the future, because this issue is not necessarily a vulnerability per se. It kind of is, but it isn't. It's hard to explain, but I'll do my best. So let's go to the history of this vulnerability. So this vulnerability got reported on November 24th, 2021 by the Alibaba security team. It got publicly disclosed on the 30th, so 6 days later. Then we started seeing Cloudflare reported that they started seeing first exploitation attempts on December 1st, like a day later. And then the official patch by Log4j, the maintainers of that, got released on December 9th. And there's been a couple of patches after that. So the reason for that is because this is not just one issue. So the original vulnerability is CVE 2021-44228. That's the one that caused this whole mess to start. But after that, when, as you guys know, when there's a security issue and there's a potential vulnerability or an issue that a security person identifies, everybody starts looking at that issue. And as is the case, a lot more people started finding vulnerabilities related to Log4j and Log4j configurations. So three more vulnerabilities, aside from the original, started popping up. So this means that if you really want to protect yourself against this family of vulnerabilities, you want to update to the latest version of Log4j 2, which is version 2.17.1. So the second vulnerability that showed up after 44228 was, after the developers patched this issue, they noticed that there was still, the patch didn't really go all the way. So people were still messing around. It wasn't complete. So there were certain misconfigurations that could still lead to remote code execution. And then the following vulnerability is more of a denial of service vulnerability. And the last one, 44832, is it's still remote code execution, but it's more restricted in how you can do it. So let's go on to the next one. Okay, so now we talked a lot about logging. Let's talk about lookups. What does lookup mean? Because this is essential to how this vulnerability works. So lookups are a functionality that is added to your logs to improve the context of the log. I don't know if you guys have seen logs before, but they can be very messy. They provide timestamps, they provide some information, but it's always a little hard to identify what the log really means if you don't have a lot of background on how that log is being created, right? So basically, lookups add context to your log files. So I just got this code snippet from a site that kind of outlined this process. So the first part on the top, the one that says the console name and the system out, that is the log4j configuration file. And basically this sets out the pattern of how you want to record your logs, right? So the first part of this red square here, it actually says, I want to record the date by hours, minutes, seconds, and then SSS, I'm assuming it's like microseconds or something. I'm not really sure on that. And to be completely transparent with you guys, I'm not a Java developer. So if there's Java developers here, you guys feel free to message me after and we can discuss, because I'm pretty sure I just learned a lot about this vulnerability in Java environments based on researching this topic. So I'm a little bit more familiar with how Java works now, but I'm not a Java developer by trade or anything like that. So if I mess anything up, I apologize in advance, but make sure to reach out to me and correct me because that's how I learn. So anyways, back to the presentation. So this log is going to record the hours, minutes, and seconds. Plus, it's also doing something funky here. It's showing a $sign and open curly brackets, env, which stands for environment, and then a variable, right? And then another variable gets added after that, followed by a trace and a level and a message layout. So we're not really interested in the second part of this. We're interested in the stuff that's being highlighted in red. So basically, if you look at the bottom, that's how the log actually looks. So you can see the 23, 57, 02, and 511. That's actually correlates to the hours, minutes, and seconds, right? And then you see the two other environment variables are also put there, right? So you would say, okay, well, why would you want to do that? So think of it like this. Whenever you're logging anything, if you don't know where that log, if you could add extra context to that log to make it more useful, you would want to do that, right? So I'll show you guys an example of exactly how that works and why you want to do that. So here we go. So log4j has a bunch of lookups that it could use to help you add context to your logs, right? One of the one that's causing the most issues at the moment is JNDI. But just think of a lookup for Docker instances and Docker containers. So imagine that you have multiple containers in your environment and they're all collecting logs, right? And they're all being centralized. Those logs are being centralized. Now, if those containers are similar in a lot of ways, the error logs are going to be similar. But how would you be able to differentiate which log belongs to which container? So this is where the lookups come in. You could set up a lookup to say, hey, give me the Docker container name, add it to the log, and then put that in the log so it's easier for me to understand what's really going on. So that's the idea behind the lookups. And it provides a lot of value to the developers or whoever is reading these and analyzing these logs to add context, like I said. So this is where we go into JNDI, because this is basically the same concept. JNDI adds context to the logs. But what does that really mean for JNDI? So JNDI is basically a Java API interface that allows JNDI to communicate with what it calls as what are the service provider interfaces. I say it's more like, I'm more familiar with networking, so they look like protocols to me. So JNDI allows the Java application to communicate with other servers that communicate in these types of protocols. For example, LDAP, DNS, RMI, and the ones that we see here below. So what's the benefit of this? So the benefit would be that instead of just calling for variables that are on your local box, like environment variables, as we saw above here, you're able to query an external remote server for information that's valuable. So it's information that's stored in a LDAP instance, for example, or an LDAP server. So can anybody think of problems with this? So basically, you're telling your logs to say, hey, do a lookup, but actually don't go to the computer that you're on. Go to another server and give me some information, pull back some data from that server and put it into the log, right? And then run it. So the problem with that is, and this is kind of, we're getting to the root of the problem here, is that, well, before we get there, let's talk about the JNDI lookup query examples. So in order for you to do a JNDI query, as we saw on the logs, you need the $, and open curly brackets, and then the lookup that you want to do, and then the SPI, which is kind of the service provider interface, which is LDAP, DNS, NIS, NDS, RMI, and CORBA. So the second example, we're just kind of growing these examples to be a little bit more clear. So you got JNDI, LDAP, and then you have a location for the LDAP server that you want to pull this object from, or this information from. So where do you want to look this up from? The problem is that, if the LDAP server that you're pointing to belongs to a bad guy, then you're pulling an object potentially from a bad source. So we wouldn't want to do that, of course. Another interesting thing is that, like I said, the SPI, we have a DNS SPI. So you could do DNS queries from within the lookup functionality of Log4j, which means that you could actually do a lookup and query and pass a lookup for an internal environment variable. So for example, on this one, you have the JNDI lookup followed by the SPI of DNS, and you're going and you're doing another query, another lookup inside the lookup, which means that these lookups are recursive. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with how recursive queries work, but that means that you have an original starting query, and then you can have multiple queries inside of that, and it's not going to cause any issues. So inside this query, you're actually inputting, you're looking up the AWS key and adding it to a domain request that you're doing to an external server. So that's a big no-no. That's a big problem, because that's leaking your information. That's sensitive, and it shouldn't be leaking to anybody but yourself. And then at the bottom, you have two more examples of how once we found that this was a possibility, the first initial instinct that people had was like, well, let me put a web application firewall to prevent these kind of requests from coming in and being logged. But as I said, these are nested queries, so which means that there's a lot of possibility to make these really hard to detect by web application firewalls. As you can see on the second to last one, it's a little harder for to write a query to capture this. All right. So now that we have a little bit more foundation of how this works, there is this great image that got posted by, it's in our, I think it was posted by the Swiss government, I believe, but they do a great job of explaining how this attack works. And I kind of want to go through with you step by step so you could kind of understand what's going on, since I gave you a little bit of a background on how the vulnerability works, so that maybe it's easier for you guys to understand. Okay, so let's start with the first part. And the interesting thing about this picture is that it also shows you the defense at each stage of the attack that is most valuable for you to use. So the first step is that you have a bad guy, and he sends you a GET request to a vulnerable server, right? And this GET request, if you can see the GET request here, it's getting the test page, and it's giving you the host victim XA, right? That's the vulnerable server. But the user agent is kind of odd. Does this look familiar to anybody? That's actually a JNDI lookup, right? And it's doing an LDAP search to an external server that we do not control. So that's interesting, right? Okay, so we send this request, the vulnerable server accepts it, doesn't think anything of it, and it starts logging it, because it's common practice to log user agents on request, right? So that's a very common practice. So it logs it to the vulnerable log4j implementation. The string is passed, as it says here. Log4j then looks at that string and says, hey, here's a lookup. Let me go resolve it and put it in the logs. So the log4j resolves it and actually does the LDAP query to the malicious LDAP server, which we control as the bad guy. The LDAP server recognizes the query and points it and returns the object that log4j asked for, which in this case would be like X, right? Which was a Java object in this case. So one of the things that we didn't discuss, and this is kind of where if you are a Java developer, you can maybe help me out here because I'm not too familiar with how the benefit of this would be. But Java apparently has the capability to use the LDAP protocol to pull objects, which are essentially Java classes, right? And pull those remotely and then run those without any other checks or anything like that. So that's what happens in step 4, is that after we call the LDAP server and we say, hey, give me this object, because that's what I need to put in my logs, the LDAP server responds with a Java class, basically that's malicious, that can do whatever we want. It's our code, sends it remotely sends it to the vulnerable server. The vulnerable server will take that class and actually run it and execute code. And that's where we get remote code execution, is the fact that we control the class that gets inputted into the vulnerable server, and the vulnerable server will just run it for us. So it's actually, it's a functionality for Java to do that, to pull objects even from remote services and execute them locally. So so that's very interesting. I didn't know about that. So that's very new. I still don't know. I still got to talk to a developer that has more background on the functionality of this for everyday use. But for me, as a security person, it made me go like, what's going on with that? So, okay, so moving on. Before I do, actually, if you see every red shield there for every step, that's the best defense that you could do. But at the time of this creation for this screenshot, actually created pretty early. There's other defenses, but these are actually some of the common things that you could do. So like I said, the WAFs would actually capture the user agent from the attacker as a way to block that before it gets to your vulnerable server. The problem with that, like I said, is that there's a lot of recursive trickery that could be done in these queries to hide it and make sure they bypass that web application firewall. Another thing that would be useful is if you don't need log4j to disable that, right? In the meantime, until it gets patched, disable that functionality entirely, and then you won't be vulnerable to this issue. And of course, the most recommended thing would be to patch log4j, which is what we recommend, of course. You could disable JNDI lookups. So the functionality, like I said, is a feature that gets added to log4j. You could disable that and you won't be as vulnerable. The problem with that is that that's not a guarantee that you're not going to be vulnerable. And then the last one would be, of course, disable remote code bases. So don't allow your Java application to pull code from remote code bases and run it. So that would be the next one. Okay, so here are some recommendations that we could do, that you guys could do if you run an environment that has Java applications. So the first thing that we tell people to do is identify the vulnerable software. So this is easier said than done, right? I can tell everybody here, go look for every Java application in your environment. Now that's very hard to do, as everybody knows. And even if you're able to do that, there's a couple of issues that come up, but just do your best to identify every Java application in your environment and then do an audit for the dependencies or libraries that that application uses and look for log4j. That's the first step. And that's still going to be a really hard step to do, but that's the first thing that we recommend. Obviously, if you know that you have this vulnerable library, make sure it's patched. Disable log4j if possible. These are more kind of workarounds, mitigations based on the requirements of your environment. Sometimes you're not going to be able to turn off an application because it's business critical. So that's up to your consideration. But here's some things that you could do to mitigate the risk. Disable log4j if possible. Use web application firewalls. Like I said, it's not guaranteed, but it helps. Isolate the vulnerable systems. If you identify a system that's running log4j or log and is vulnerable, make sure you isolate that so that it doesn't communicate with external servers outside of the environment. Disable JNDI lookups, disable remote code bases, and prioritize patching, right? So if you can't patch every system in your environment, just make sure that you patch those mission critical ones, right? That would be ideal until everything else gets patched. And like I said, another thing would be isolate your system, make sure that it can't communicate to LDAP servers, DNS servers, RMI through network traffic. And that way you avoid disclosing any information or pulling Java code that's not controlled by you. So here's what we recommend to our clients. This is a vulnerability that's very unique because it's very hard to identify and detect, right? So a Java library, as I understand now, is basically it's in a jar file or a Java archive file, which is similar to like a zip file. And those libraries are stored on your system, your development system, wherever your application is. So you can actually, what the information security community did is they hashed the log4j vulnerable library. They created a hash of that file, and then they created scanners to look for that hash. So we have scanners that actually go through every jar file in your computer and compare it to the hash of the vulnerable library to identify it, right? So that's what we recommend. I'm going to provide you guys with some scanners that are freely available that you can run in your systems to make sure that you're not running this vulnerable library. And that's what we recommend to clients. Again, from an external perspective, if we don't have access to your code base, it's really hard to detect. But we try our best by doing several things. So we recommend our clients do internal vulnerability scans just to get it out of the way, make sure to get the low hanging fruit. And we also just don't do one. Detecting this vulnerability is kind of difficult, as I said, because it won't trigger until it's actually logged by log4j. So, it's really hard to detect. But it's something that you have to do. So we do multiple scans over a period of time. We also do credential scans internally for the internal environment, meaning that internal scans actually give us a little bit more access, and it's similar to the hash scans. It's just that we have more authentication and we navigate, and the scanners actually look through the files to look for that library. And if you have a Java application that you've checked, but you want to make sure that it's not vulnerable to this, then we also have more focused tests where we do application security assessments, where we try a bunch of attacks to make sure that this vulnerability is triggered, and then we can identify it.
Hey, JR, just letting you know we're coming up close to time. Just so
okay, awesome. I only have a couple more slides. So this is where the interesting part is, problems for security folks, right? So keeping logs is usually a good thing, right? I think everybody, I don't think I've ever heard anybody that's keeping too many logs, right? It's usually a recommendation that we give to our clients to say, hey, make sure you log everything just to make sure that we can actually see if there's an incident, you can go back and look at what actually happened. But this vulnerability is making logs look like keeping logs is a bad thing, right? So we have to identify, this is a problem that I have to communicate with people and say, we found this issue was found in a logging library, but that doesn't mean that logging is bad and you should still do it. So that's going to be an interesting thing to talk about in the future, because yeah, it might be some confusion. Like I can already see some people saying like, well, I could just disable logging and get rid of this issue. And that's true, but that's not a good security fix. It's just temporary and it might cause more issues. The log4j library could be anywhere. So even if you are on top of your environment and you know exactly what Java applications are running this library and you patch them all, that's good and great. However, if you have any third-party vendors in your environment and they're running Java applications and they're not patching, you're still vulnerable because of them. So that's something to keep in mind. And then open source libraries are going to be an issue. I think, I don't know if you guys heard the story a couple of days ago of this developer, I think he's from New York, that kind of went a little haywire, and he was the maintainer for a Node.js library that was very popular. And he pushed an update to those libraries that kind of disabled them and gave them, they stopped working, which meant that all the people that depended on those libraries, all their applications also stopped working. So I think that we're going to start seeing more and more of these issues where you have open source libraries that are not, just because they're open source doesn't mean that they're secure. I think the security issue with open source stuff is that people believe that since it's available and everybody can see the code, then it's more secure. And for the most, I think that's true to an extent. However, if nobody's looking at the code, then those vulnerabilities are still going to be there, right? And again, this comes back to another issue that's interesting for me as a security person, is to say, is it fair that a corporation is using this third-party software that's maintained by like 2 guys, right, or something like that? So that's something that's interesting because they're volunteers and they're not getting paid for that work. So that's another interesting question. So here's the scanners that I talked about that you guys can look up after the presentation to kind of research to see if they fit whatever you guys need to do for your environments. And then here's some of the resources that I used for this presentation. Okay, that was pretty much all my stuff that I had. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, JR. So everyone, if you have any questions, you can just throw them now into the Q&A box. And we do have one right here that we can start with. So is the attack always done via modifying the attacker's user agent, or is there another attack vector?
No, that's a really good question. So there is it doesn't just have to be the user agent. It could be anything that's logged. So there's multiple there's multiple HTTP fields that could be used, but it just has to be logged. It just has to be passed to log4j. So that's the interesting part, and that's what makes it so difficult to detect, because let's say that you're not logging the user agent, you're like, well, I'm safe, but that's not true. If you're logging anything else that the malicious user could send data to and actually get logged, then you're still going to be vulnerable. So that's a really good question.
Awesome. I think honestly, you answered most of the questions that came in during the presentation. So that's great. And a lot of people are asking if you could just show actually the resources slide again.
Oh,
Some people are asking for those. And just as a reminder, everyone, we will be sending out the recording of this, so you'll be able to see all those resources and the scanners that JR had linked there once it's up on the website later today. In the meantime, JR, is there a way that people can get in touch with you?
Yeah, JR4Infosec on Twitter is my handle. I didn't put it, I forgot to give that to you, Colleen, but yeah, that's my handle. If you guys have any questions, I'll be on there. So JR, the number 4, and then infosec@twitter.com.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, I think that's all that we have for today then. Thanks everyone for coming. We really appreciate it. And thank you, JR, for taking the time. This is a great presentation and super insightful. Everyone, please reach out if you are looking for security services, either reach out directly to JR or reach out to us via email. JR just put the resources page back up there. Like I said, a recording of this event will be available this afternoon. And we are going to be releasing our next meetup. That's going to be in February. So keep an eye out for that.